On Tuesday, December 18th, 2018, at 3:22 a.m., I purchased a lot of magazines on eBay with the idea of creating a new show on YouTube based in part upon the Comics Journal. This morning, after making my initial purchase, I woke to the news that Gary Groth was going to start publishing TCJ as an actual magazine again, which seemed more than a mere coincidence. I considered it an auspicious sign and began to plan my new show in earnest. However, life has a way of getting in the way of even the best laid plans, and I've been forced to change my original production schedule. I was all set to launch a new weekly program with the new year, yet for reasons beyond my control, I won't actually be able to commit to that schedule until the spring and summer now. Yet, as I still had a brief window of opportunity for the next month, I've created a pilot miniseries to gauge interest and experiment with the format a bit. In the meantime, I've chosen to save that huge stack of comics journals for the actual series and will focus instead upon TCJ's companion title in this four-part program. Least we forget, Kim Thompson once claimed in an interview that Amazing Heroes wasn't too far from the earliest comics journals. And since Amazing Heroes was also published by Fantagraphics, it is a logical extension of the show's basic concept. Exposition is the literary term for the insertion of important background information that explains what's happening in a story or puts the events into context. Live from Darshan Studios, it's Zinc Comics Exposition. I'm your host, Mr. Exposition himself, Brian Payne. In comics, a lot of background information in past situations can be quickly explained in a simple caption box. Amazing Heroes, number 144, cover date July 1, 1988. Let's see here. There we go. Amazing Heroes, 144. From Bugtown back to here, and an interview with Matt Howarth. Matt Howarth, Particle Dreams from Fantagraphics, Savage Henry, or those annoying Post Brothers from Vortex, Changes in Heavy Metal. Changes in Heavy Metal is one of the first comics I ever read that made me sit up and take note. For me, growing up, comics was the Sunday newspaper and the daily strips, the occasional Mad magazine. I never really read many comics, but people knew we're talking about Mobius, and I heard the talk, and I saw a few copies of Heavy Metal at friends' houses and would leaf through them. And I remember turning the page to Matt Howarth changes. It was called, I believe, Enosification, and it had something to do with Eno and prog rock and a band, and hit the line, and just the sheer look of it being hand drawn made me want to read that story, whereas I had just been leafing through the magazine. I didn't hear more about Matt Howarth for a while, but I remember picking up another issue and seeing him again, and was like, okay, this is somebody to watch out for. And it wasn't till long time later that I bought a big stack of the Post Brothers books. But I always liked him, And I always thought he was a unique cat, and had a his stories were definitely his and his alone. Although he worked with a lot of collaborators, in fact, it seems like his first collaborator on Changes. I don't know if it was his first, but on Changes anyway, the heavy metal story was Lou Stathis. And it was him who actually got the gig with Vortex to publish the Post Brothers. I guess he knew Bill Marks or ran into Bill Marks at some time, and that was how the Post Brothers came out. That I ended up collecting later on, years after I read that heavy metal magazine. Anyway, I really like a couple of things Howard says in this interview about creating, especially too. I'm afraid my brain works a lot like my storytelling works. It's very stream of consciousness. I do not work that way most writers, artists do. Sometimes I'll sit down with a story, sometimes with just a bunch of empty pages, and just start drawing whatever I feel like. Maybe by about page 8, I'll have a flow going and be able to come up with a story. I thought I was the only one who did that, but I imagine there's more of us out there. But I like that idea of cartooning. Chris Ware talked about the strength of cartooning is writing as you draw, and it's definitely that. It's the two-prong attack, and to me, you got to follow your pen, So I think too structured of a script, while it can be good, for me personally, would be a nightmare. The one time I worked with the script, even then I was rearranging things and without permission, so I never knew what they thought of that. I know one change I made got changed back, so but I always feel like, I'm drawing it, so I have to go where I go, and this seems to work better for me. And if I stuck to the script too religiously, it would hamper the story in the end. He talks about how Changes was made up as he went along, or at least for a while, and how the shifting realities came up because he just wanted to draw different backgrounds, and that story device allowed him that ability, which always was something I liked about the Post Brothers. And I guess that story, I can't remember Changes as well as I should, other than the fact that it had a big impact on me. And I haven't read it since. If I can track down a copy, I will. But Post Brothers comics are pretty easy to come by, and especially if you contact Matt personally. I think he's got a store set up, Bugtown, or I believe it's called. But and he talked about how he was. I remember him in heavy metal doing this review. Later on, I got a few copies, and they had a lot of text at one time. They were very text heavy. I don't know the exact time period, but I know they went from mostly glossy art. They still had that, but there was a big text section and they had record reviews and stories about other things. And he did a strip in there about that were record reviews. And I've always associated Matt Howarth with music, and I think that's one of the main reasons. Is not only what in the first image I saw him draw was it alluding to Eno, but he also did these strips in heavy metal that were record reviews. But in the interview, he says, I never in my reviews pulled off the critic approach. A lot of times I'll just tell people about something they don't know. I'll describe it and leave it to them. My tastes are esoteric. And he was really into a lot of prog rock, and especially like uh, Tangerine Dream and the German prog, or electronic music, I guess it would be called. But I remember learning a lot from him in those reviews years later about prog rock, and especially electronic music and a few other things too. But I'll always remember Tangerine Dream and him had an affinity for one another. And he also drew. He talks about how he got into doing covers for tapes and albums as well. So that music connection was strong. And I know he did some Residents comics and maybe some artwork for them as well. The Residents, and so I remember seeing bits and pieces of his stuff in odd places and in different contexts, and that also appealed to me about the way he re- created comics, that they were malleable to different uh, mediums, I guess is the word I'm looking for. But he says here, I feel that comics are a form of interaction between the reader and the character. And I do think that's true, but it's also the reader and the artist. But I see what he's saying there. And that's the great thing. You can have a cartoon character saying something, and I could say the same thing and you wouldn't listen to me, but if I put it in the mouth of a cartoon character, you might read it and think about what the words I'm saying rather than who's saying it or not. Uh, but this article in Amazing Heroes 144 is pretty interesting. And I was hoping to get more into, his process of, actually technical stuff, gearhead talk, from the studio. I use this, I use that. But he does talk about how he draws fast. And he also talks about drawing on just any old paper, oftentimes typing paper. And I thought that was interesting because I always think I have to have the right tool, the perfect paper, and I have to think it helps. It can't hurt, but the fact that he's able to whip out these cartoons not only fast but basically on a piece of typing paper with a probably a technical pen, that's pretty amazing. Or at least early on, that's what he was doing. Anyway, he talks about how uh, comics. The first comic he remembered was the Vault of Horror, and that it just amazed him. And that he also talks about how in the '60s, when Fantastic Four came out, people forget how different it was and how great it was, and how important the Green Lantern and Green Arrow stories were. Uh, well, he doesn't say important, he says quintessential. So that can be taken a couple of ways, I guess. But he talks about how those were important, but now when you look back at both, they're a little dated and perhaps overly melodramatic. But he talks about how it's the difference in our culture, and how uh, you used to have to go to the movies for scare to see a scary film or a Hitchcock film, and that now, as he puts it, you turn on the news and you see snuff footage, and that about sums it up, I have to think. And another thing I thought was interesting was he says, I think the act of creating is very much like the effects of LSD on the brain. In short circuits, the synapses you have, synapses hitting each other that would not normally connect. Creativity is not inspiration or coming up with stories. It's putting pieces together that would not normally go together. From there, the writer, creator strings the rest of that. And I definitely think that's part of it. And that ideas, he says, don't come to him in a little light bulb, and the initial kernel might, but you end up putting in a lot of work and rework and rethought. Maybe sometimes too much thought in my own case, but and he talks about how he can change a story and the nice thing is that he can do it. Nobody can tell him that he can't change the ending or something as he's going, if that's how it works. And finally, one thing he says that kind of made me laugh was that he has tons of graphic novels and stories sitting on the shelf waiting to be finished. And he even has a superhero series that he's working on. And he said, no one would ever expect me to do one of these. It's not that I have a desire to do superheroes, but I'd like to see what I do. Let's face it. Somebody call me tomorrow and offer me Spider-Man. They're not going to let me do it once they see my script. My art style, my inking style, it's just not traditional superhero. So that's Matt Howarth at his best, I think. And he does talk a bit about things that his process, in that he usually will pencil the whole thing and make writing notations, then go back and write it. So basically Marvel method, which I like myself. And it goes back to that Chris Ware quote about writing while you draw. And I think that's important with comics. And he likes finally, his final comment is he enjoys blurring the distinctions between the real world and realities in my work. And I think that's a pretty good summation of the Post Brothers particularly, and which, I suggest you grab a copy because they're really great comics and they're still easily attainable. Something I really enjoy is the Post Brothers. Now let's go on to a different cartoonist and issue now. Let's go with Woo! The Return of Megaton Man. Simpson Speaks Out. Amazing Heroes 147, cover date August 15th, 1988. This is an interview conducted by Tom Powers. Let's see. The interview I was reading from about Matt Howarth was by Richard S. McEnroe. So let's give the authors credit where credit is due. Just leafing through these, they act as memories and springboards for my own thoughts, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to do that stream of consciousness thing. But Don Simpson, Megaton Man, Border Worlds. He did in those Action Comics Weekly. He inked Gil Kane for a brief time. Of course, he did the 1963 book with Miller and Bissett and Vetch and crew, and a book I really like too. But where I first discovered Don Simpson was in Wasteland. Wasteland, he describes it in here. Let's see here. As a horror anthology. And the idea was there'd be 4 rotating artists doing 9-page stories and covers. And he got suggested by Bill Loebs, I guess, put his name into the hat. And he got the gig, and that's where I saw him. And he's the only artist that stuck through the whole series, I think. And that's what I always liked, that idea of a rotating cast of artists. They would move one story closer, one artist's story closer to the front each issue, and whoever was on the cover would go to the back of the line and start up again. And eventually you'd have a month where you don't have to draw 8 pages or 9 pages, but do the cover. So I always wanted to do something like that, but I imagine the logistics can be a nightmare. I really, the Mike Gold, I believe, was the editor of that book, Wasteland, and it's known for John Ostrander's writing, and the fact that it's I believe, the only comic that Del Close, the late great Del Close, wrote or at least contributed to the writing of. But Don's style immediately stood out in those Wasteland books. He does a story based on a true story about Del Close, high on LSD, roller skating through the sewers with a propane torch taped to a helmet on his head. Whether that's just a flight of fancy, mildly rooted in truth, I can believe that it was real truth, knowing the stories of Del Close, though. But I always thought that was an interesting. That was, I believe, the first look I got on Dandy Don Simpson's artwork. The next thing I probably saw, I don't know if I saw Megaton Man or Bizarre Heroes first. I have to think it was Bizarre Heroes. And then I started working my way back and picking up Borderlands, the Megaton Man original comics and miniseries. He's talked at length about how he regrets doing everything as 3 of this and 4 of that because it messed with the numbering. But from a sales standpoint, I guess you can almost see it, but that's almost. But anyway, his artwork is, he always reminded me of Keith Pollard for some reason, but he takes it into like almost mad characterization at times, but he can also draw like straight up heroes, as he showed in Bizarre Heroes, even though there was a lot of humor with that book, but there was some great artwork in that. And he could handle any mainstream book, but he prefers to do these other things, which Miss Megaton Man is one of my favorite characters of all time, and probably my favorite female character. So I always loved the fact that it's Miss Megaton Man too. Don't make don't make no concessions there. That's a great name. Cracks me up every time I see it. And he talks of Don goes more into the dollars and cents of this and how that business of cartooning and how that Wasteland gave him pretty good money that he'd never made before, but it lived up to its name and was at the bottom of the sales figures. And it was obviously a labor of love for somebody, but he admits that he can't say that about himself. I've heard him, I don't think he holds that up as one of his great works, but I think there's a lot of love for Wasteland out there. I know Mikhail Fifi's Copra Club seemed to have a lot of fond memories of Wasteland, and they were the first ones I found that did. I thought it was a book that only I kind of really liked, and I actually met Del Close once, and he's done all these amazing things. He's been with Second City. He's formed the committee. I think he was on My Mother, the Car. And when I met him, all I wanted to do was talk about Wasteland and comics, and he seemed bemused by that fact. And I had been an extra in a film he was in called Light of Day, and I told him that we starred in the same film. And when he signed me an autograph, he wrote, fellow cast member in Light of Day, to Brian, fellow cast member in Light of Day. And he did something nobody I've ever asked for an autograph from has ever done before, and that's flip over the autograph and give me his address. So that I wrote him a letter, he wrote me one back, not a lot, maybe 2 or 3, but I remember getting a Thanksgiving card from him, and he was in some horror movie, and it was like a card from that horror movie, and he said something like, Brian, have a happy Thanksgiving. I hope you get your head ripped off for Christmas, or something like that. And there was some image that applied to that on the card, like a skull or something. It was kind of interesting. But Del was a great guy, and I don't know if Simpson had any interaction with Del Close or not in writing those stories, or whether he just got a script and talked to the editor. I really don't know. And he also talks about how he went back to school so that he could learn different art techniques, because if you're going to sell out, there's better money in airbrushing and retouching and storyboards than drawing comics. So he said, though, that he admits that in all likelihood he'll spend the rest of his life drawing comics. But and he does have a few in the works right now, I know, and he has a blog. But I think he also he's now like a professor. I don't know if he teaches or what, or lectures, but he did exactly what he was going to say in this interview. I mean, he went back to college, and he's now Dr. Donald Simpson, not Dandy Don. So my hat's off to him there. He also talks about how he likes superheroes, and that he read Mobius, Crumb, and Spiegelman and Wood and all that, and Yummy Fur, but he also liked Steranko and Kirby, which it's a rare thing nowadays that people admit that. But you know, I always liked the fact that you know when you can tip your hat to what went before. And there seems to be too many people talking bad about superheroes, and I understand the rap. They deserve quite a bit of it, but so does all comics. There's good and bad in everything, and let's face it, most of us, the first comic we read is a superhero comic book, and if not that, then we've read one in our lives and enjoyed them too. Uh, my voice is all scratchy. Please forgive me. But he also, in talking about superheroes, he talks about how they're built upon strong anatomy and figure drawing and gesture, and that a superhero is basically, I've heard other people say this too, it's a nude with a few lines on it for boots and perhaps gloves, but otherwise it's a nude. And, it's up to the colorist to make it have clothes on, not the artist. That emblem on their chest could just be some strange tattoo. But anyway, I never read Don Simpson's King Kong, and he doesn't talk about it here, but I've seen a few pages of it recently, and it's really something I want to track down because it looks really good and quite different, as is the Anton Drek stuff that Don did for Eros Comics. But one of the few, I've got a Batman shirt, I think. I got a Superman shirt somewhere, but the one comic book shirt that I was really proud of to wear was the Windy Whitebread t-shirt. Seemed to get people's attention when I wore that. Windy Whitebread was one of his Eros comics, which he did under the name Anton Drek. Eros was basically soft porn or hardcore porn, depending on who wrote and drew it, I think. But Windy Whitebread was pretty white bread, so it was more funny than it was erotic. I sincerely doubt anybody was shaking hands with Aquaman while reading Windy Whitebread or any of the Anton Drek Eros books. And he talks about how you're hired hands with the big two, basically, or work for hired contract. You're a hired hand. And for superstar creators to get real propriety or whatever character they earn to trust the companies to give them, whether this cracks me up, whether or not Catwoman is a prostitute is an essential part of Frank Miller's vision or not. It really sort of minor compared to Warren Communications' need to make money or whatever. And what he's pointing out is that, it's a product. These corporations buy them because they sell and they can make money. And, even if it's only in merchandise and movies, that's enough to keep comics alive. And, I doubt we'll ever see the Megaton Man movie, but the comic, there's very few comic book movies that really are good. Let's face it. Ghost World's pretty good. Documentaries are good. American Splendor's good because it's part documentary, I guess, and very few others. I mean, the next one I can probably think of is that one with Paul Newman and Tom Hanks. Perdition. I can't remember. There's a couple Perditions. It's one of the Perdition books by Max Allan Collins, and it's drawn by, I believe. No, I'm thinking of History of Violence. There, History of Violence is drawn by the guy who did Dead World, the comic Dead World. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but I didn't know the connection until recently, and I've always liked the artwork in both History of Violence, which is also another fair movie, comic book movie, pretty good, and the artwork in Road to Perdition. That's what it is, Road to Perdition. It's the first one. The artwork in that is outstanding too. Both those books, I really liked the artwork, mainly because it looks hand drawn. Anyway, that's all she wrote for this week, I think. So until next week, think Zinc.